Hey everybody in Zoom. And hi everybody in person. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. That intro is like, clearly I wrote that because nobody else says that many nice things about me. Thank you very much for that. I'm very humbled to be here this evening. I first of all want to thank all of you, because the work of friends organizations like the Weaselhead Preservation Society is how conservation moves forward on the ground across Alberta. So thank you all for the work that you do to make one of the most cool wildernessy places in Calgary cooler and cooler by the day. I personally love the Weaselhead, even though I don't live in Calgary, so thank you. All right, so we have a very interesting technological situation here this evening. We're hoping that it all goes through smoothly, so let's just keep some fingers crossed. If you are tuning in on Zoom, sorry about that, but we have connectivity issues because of technology, you know, whatever is what it is. Please turn your video off if you haven't already done so. Okay, so back to this idea that grizzly bear management is people management. Grizzly bears are a statistical nightmare. Sample sizes are small. If you know anything about stats, you know that small sample sizes is what turns your hair gray. So, but always get big samples. It's a lot easier to collect that data. And the other part about this is that a lot of work when it comes to bear management is about coexistence. And coexistence is a two-way street. It's about bears and it's about people. And so when we focus our research only on bears, we're missing more than half of the issue. Without us, bears are just fine. They're just out there on the landscape being bears, and they're very happy about it. We need to manage our own behavior to ensure that bears have space to just be bears. Next slide. Thank you. So, you might have to click it a few times, or just one more time. They're all going to come automatically. So, I mean, you heard a lot about me in that really long introduction, so I'm not really going to tell you very much about myself. But I guess what you know is that I made a curtain, and I've been, oh yeah, is it coming again? There we go. I've been recreating in Banff since I was a kid. And I live in Canmore now, and I've been in Canmore for the last 15 years. I believe in enjoying our mountain parks by bike, hiking boot, climbing shoe, and flip-flops, and skates sometimes. And I believe in doing all of those things with the people I love. I think we're incredibly blessed here in Alberta to have an array and a diversity of wilderness to appreciate and enjoy. And I think sometimes we get stuck in this concept that parks are for people or parks are for wildlife, but really it's about both of those things. So now you can go to the next slide. So I kind of love grizzly bears, like a lot. I think they're pretty amazing and cute and cuddly and fascinating and misunderstood and magical, inspirational animals. For these reasons and countless more, I've devoted my career to researching their behaviors, protecting their habitat, and helping people better coexist with them. I'm going to use the word coexistence throughout this talk, but I want to take a minute to share with you what it means to me. It means living in the same place at the same time with grizzly bears. That doesn't mean that I want to have a grizzly bear in my kitchen, but it means that I recognize that I live in Canmore and grizzly bears live in Canmore, and that's okay. Not fearing them and them not fearing us. It actually means that we live together. Sorry. I've always valued an interdisciplinary approach to, oh no, you're going too fast. I'm gonna say next slide. Yeah, stay back here. I've always valued an interdisciplinary approach to grizzly bear research and management, and this is me doing my master's work on the northwest coast of BC in the Coutts-Matine Provincial Conservancy. This area is very different from Alberta. In this remote wilderness, all human activity is focused on the water and is largely associated with bear viewing tourism. Bears come down to the inlet shores to feed on sedge grasses in the spring and summer, making observing them easy for anyone, including me, just standing on a boat looking for a bear. I'm not going to focus too much on coastal research tonight, but I'll be happy to answer questions about it later. All I'll say right now is that this work showed me what kinds of relationships between bears and people are possible. My research focused on defining potential impacts of boat-based recreation tourism on bear behavior and visitor perceptions of impact. My resulting recommendations were used to create the Bear Viewing Guidelines for British Columbia. In a similar vein, for my PhD, look at that big smile. I'm so happy doing all that field work in the rain sometimes. Was similar, but in a different setting. So basically, I wanted to understand a bit more about what bears do when they're trying to access high quality trails in the national parks, in the Rocky Mountain National Parks. My research looked at how often bears use trails and the habitat adjacent to it. But I also did a trail user survey to assess what expectations people had of bear management of the national parks. The primary thing that I've always strived in my research is to define the human perspective as well as the grizzly bear one, and to use that information to influence management policy to improve the situation for bears. So you don't have to read this, fortunately, because you can't. But if I could put my PhD into one page, this would be it. This is how my brain works. The main thing I want you to see is that this is a person and this is a bear. And when a bear and person encounter each other on a trail or in the neighborhood or wherever, what happens next is dependent on who the bear is and who the person is. You don't need to see what it says, but a person comes to that interaction with the bear with all their preconceived notions of what is going to happen next. They may be fearful, they maybe have heard stories of bears attacking people or charging people, or maybe they've just seen bears on Disney movies who are cute and cuddly, and all of that influences what they think the bear will do. But the bear also has its preconceived notions of what running into a person is going to be like. Maybe that bear has had negative interactions with people. Maybe that bear has been chased by an off-leash dog before. Maybe that bear is grumpy because it got into an altercation with another bigger bear earlier today and is like, holy crap, could I just eat some friggin' berries? Like, could I just have some alone time, please? And you don't know any of that. That hiker and that bear running into each other on the trail have no idea what the other is thinking. And I bring that up because often what happens next is based on how the human reacts and how the bear reacts to the human's reaction, if that makes any sense. And so basically, I used that to create my PhD question, which was really around like, how do bears use habitat around people? Next slide. Right. So before we launch into my research results, and don't worry, there's only a few graphs, it's not going to be that kind of talk, but I know that when I do these talks, there's always some other science nerds in the audience like me who are like, show me a bar graph about that. So I've got a bar graph right coming up later. But before we launch into the research results, I just want to give you a little insight into what we know about Alberta grizzly bears already. So once upon a time, grizzly bears roamed across Western Canada, across the Western US, all the way down into central Mexico. That range has shrunk considerably. And today, Alberta is really on the front lines of grizzly bear distribution in Canada. Because of their shrinking range and population, the Alberta government has listed grizzly bears as threatened under the Alberta Wildlife Act. And this map shows the current core and secondary areas of their range, which influence how we manage them. So this is from the 2008 Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan, but these boundaries haven't changed with the new recovery plan. The important thing is that the recovery plan identifies core areas, which are areas where we want the grizzly bear population to grow and become healthier and bigger. And this tend to be protected areas. There's no private land really in core areas is the main thing. Secondary zones are areas where we will tolerate grizzly bears, but we don't really want them to be too comfortable in there. And we apply aversive conditioning to make sure that they're avoiding human infrastructure and human settlements in those kinds of places. What I want you to understand is that grizzly bears navigate a really complex landscape in Alberta. One grizzly bear can have the average home range size of a male grizzly bear is upwards of 300 square kilometers. That's the space that he needs to access food, shelter, and mates. And that home range, 300 square kilometers, is big enough to overlap national parks, provincial parks, public lands, private lands, and all highways and all that kind of stuff as well. And so in each of those jurisdictions, how a grizzly bear is managed is different. And we've written a complex rule book for bear behavior for bears to survive on the Alberta landscape. But as I mentioned, they don't speak English. They also don't read English. And so it's really difficult for a bear to know how to go about being a bear without getting into trouble, because it can do one thing in the national park, and that's fine. And it does that exact same thing on Alberta public lands, and it's really, really not fine, and bad things happen. So there's a few things that you should also know about our grizzly bear population in Alberta is that at best, Alberta habitat is subpar. Bears are kind of hangry most of the time. Now, a lot of you here don't know me, but I get angry, and that is the combination of being hungry and angry at the same time. And when I'm hangry, I am not very pleasant. And my husband literally makes me sit down and eat food. Because like, stop talking, you're being annoying, eat something. And then 20 minutes later, I'm like, okay, I feel so much better. Sorry, it's being such a We're kind of hangry in Alberta most of the time. There's no protein here, so there's no fish. Like, there is protein, but there's not a big salmon run. And so because of that, bears tend to be a smaller size in the interior. They also tend to have larger home ranges because they have to go farther afield to get the calories that they need. They have lower reproductive rates. And basically, Alberta's grizzly bears have the lowest reproductive rates of any grizzly bear population in North America, just because the habitat is kind of. Now, layer on top of that people and highways and private property and all that kind of stuff, and it really kind of starts to paint a picture of it being a pretty hard life for an Alberta grizzly bear to just survive and get through the day. And in fact, nearly 75% of bears in Alberta do not survive to sexual maturity. So when we talk about recovering grizzly bears in Alberta, we gotta crank out a lot of babies, because a lot of those babies are not gonna make it to have babies of their own. And protected areas such as the national and provincial parks have the opportunity to serve as sources for these threatened grizzly bear populations if they're appropriately managed. Next slide. So what did my research find about grizzly bear habitat use? Some pretty consistent themes here. So what we know, well, I guess I should tell you the maps. Unfortunately, the lighting in here is not great. So these are basically home ranges of grizzly bears in the spring, summer, and fall. And basically in the spring, we see grizzly bear habitat home ranges are smaller. They're concentrated in the valley bottoms. And that's because the valley bottoms melt and everything else is snowbound, so all the food is in the valley bottoms. But guess where people also concentrate in the spring? In the valley bottoms. The skiing is done and the hiking is not open yet, so everybody's hanging out in the valley bottoms, and you can have a lot of actions. In the summer, grizzly bear home ranges kind of expand a little bit more, and then in the fall they expand even more up into the higher elevations. What we know is that grizzly bears consistently select for the highest quality habitat. They've got 7 months of the year to eat 12 months of worth of calories, and it is all about food all the time. So they will go where the food is. If the food happens to be in your back alley, guess where the bears are going? In your back alley. We know that how people use the landscape influences how grizzly bears use the landscape too. So we know that bears want to avoid people, but it comes at a pretty interesting cost. Like in the spring, the dandelions in the ditch are like really, really good, and that's really good food. I don't really want to be by people, but that food source can be worth it. It can be worth the sacrifice to be next to people. Well, what we also know is that when grizzly bears select habitat close to people, they have a higher chance of mortality from vehicles or any number of ways that they can perish. They select habitat close to roads, but they don't like crossing roads. And they like to select habitat close to low-use trails. This is from my research, especially during the day. But they cross low-use trails more often. And they also have higher movement rates during the day. So that's actually good news. There's populations of grizzly bears in BC that have been so highly impacted by human use that they've shifted to nocturnal behavior, but we're not quite there yet in Alberta, so that's good. My remote cameras give us a glimpse of how bears use trails. Next slide. These are all pictures of bears in Banff National Park. I mean, just look. So one of the important findings was that bears will use trails any time of day, but their use is somewhat dependent on when people are going to be using that same trail. One of the threshold analyses that I used found that grizzly bears are more likely to use a trail before 8 human events since dawn. And I was just reading a paper today that was suggesting 40 people over 2 weeks is enough to displace wildlife from using an area. So the more we're learning about how wildlife select habitat around people, the more we're learning that it doesn't take very many people to stop wildlife from using that habitat. While activity levels are still highest during the day, bears are purposely seeking times of day to use trails when they're less likely to encounter people. And I think that's really important for us to understand, because for those of us who are afraid of bears or who think they're out to get us, I think it's really important to know that bears actually are trying to avoid people. They really don't want to see you, or me, or my kids, or my dog, especially. What I think is important to understand is that bears are taking active measures to avoid people. They aren't just randomly going through their habitat without thinking about them. Next slide. And so what about the people? Who is recreating in our national parks? Well, the quick answer is everybody. Up until the pandemic, there's been some changes there. So my remote cameras found people active on trails any time of day, as early as 4:30 a.m. and as late as midnight. That creates a very small window where bears can use trails without the risk of running into people. And I want you to think about that, because we can manage people in 2 ways. We can manage them in space, and we can manage them in time. And I'm going to come back to that. People also engage in a variety of recreational activities in our national parks and on public lands. I mean, you all know it. You know what they all are because you see them all in the Weaselhead, I'm sure. And people have a relationship with bears even if they haven't met. What I mean by this is that people have expectations about bears, their behavior, encounter probability, and even what steps land managers take to manage bears and encounter risk. Some people prepare for recreating in bear country, and others don't think the chance of an encounter is high enough to even think about it. All of these things feed into what we believe will happen when we encounter a bear. Next slide. And hit it again. And hit it again. There you go, that's what I wanted. Okay. Okay, so I asked people what kind of steps they took to prepare for recreating in bear country, and usually people had a first aid kit. But that's not really bear specific. Less than 40% of people recreating in the national parks had bear spray with them. And bear spray has saved lives, and it has become more common, but it's expensive for the casual hiker or visitor. People were also more likely to have bear spray if they were on a backcountry trip. But remember what I said about how the habitats overlap. Encounters are actually more likely in the front country than in the backcountry. In the backcountry, there's a ton of space. In the front country, there is very little space. So we think about taking bear spray. We're going into the backcountry. We really need to be prepared for a wilderness experience. We take all of these safety measures. But actually, we have a higher chance of encountering bears in the front country. And in the Bow Valley, it's just as high when I'm just taking my dog for a walk through the neighborhood as it is when I'm in the backcountry with him. And then if we look here, so this slide's a little bit funny. It's okay. So I asked people to rank management options that they supported. And what I want to show here is that these management options were ones that people liked. So having trail opening times, groups more than 4, rerouting a trail, not having dogs, closing the trail, putting up a warning sign. These are all management options that actually target people. None of them target bears. The management options that people were opposed to were aversive conditioning, relocation, not doing anything. People always think you should be doing something, and encouraging more people to hike the trail. But people don't like the management actions that target the bears themselves. So I'll also just say this is in a national park. It's very different when you have a bear in your neighborhood. But in general, people are more supportive of management options that are about people than about bears. And on this graph here, this is the only graph you're going to see. But don't worry, there's a table with too much text coming next. So I asked people how they felt about these options, if it was a lone grizzly bear or a female with cubs, because females with cubs we know are a bit more sensitive. People tend to have a bit more fear about that. And yeah, don't worry about it. So the dark lines, there's no lines now. Okay. Okay, yeah, so the dark lines there, basically people are more supportive of doing nothing or applying aversive conditioning if it's a lone grizzly bear by itself. But if it was a female with cubs, there was a lot more support for things like limiting the number of people or closing the trail. So there is sort of this recognition that females are a little more sensitive and need more space. And you can go to the next slide, but I actually think I'm just going to skip over that altogether. So go 2 slides ahead. See, there it is, too much text, let's move on. Okay. Now we're going to talk about So this is my book. This is very exciting. It has pictures of bears. Ooh la la. So, you know, I've worked in research and I worked for government in Alberta parks. And one of the reasons why I wrote a book is because you're not actually allowed to say what you think most of the time when you work with large carnivores until you don't work for anybody. And then you can put it in a book and you can sell it. So, but throughout my research, I became more and more aware that bears have personalities and they're individuals, and that individuality can't be captured in a graph or a data point. It can't even be captured in a story in my PhD because the PhD can only talk about the data. And you sure as heck have a hard time reflecting that individuality when you work for government and you're trying to talk about this bear. And so I wanted to have an opportunity to share some of those personalities and events that happen to bears that predispose them to act in a certain way. I wanted to share what bears had taught me, not just the science behind my research, but what they had taught me about who they were and who I am when I'm with them. I pitched this idea to John Marriott. He's a good friend of mine and a wildlife photographer in Canmore. And I literally said, my text, your pictures, awesome means awesome. And he was like, next slide. So John is a very good friend, and I've worked with him on this project. Over time, we've worked on a few different projects together. But what I love is that we both value communicating bear conservation issues or influencing habitat management to protect bear access to high quality habitat. And what I really like about working with John is that we're on the same page. We both value bears and their right to exist in a landscape where they are free to access the foods they like without people getting in the way. We both believe that people can take actions to improve the human-bear relationship, and that it's easier to ask people to cut down a crabapple tree in their yard than it is to ask a bear not to eat delicious crabapples. Over the years, he's become a good friend, and our families even spend time together, and yeah, we're just very lucky to have each other. Next slide. So what is our book about? I mean, it's about this lovely creature here. As a scientist, I value data, and there is a ton of research about bear behavior and habitat use that the average person may not have access to, because I'm pretty sure none of you are reading the Journal of Wildlife Management, and that's okay. I'll read it, and then I'll just tell you. Lisa's like, I've got the latest issue. Okay, she's a science nerd that the graph was for. Through my work and my play, I've been blessed to spend hour upon hour with bears, watching them, writing down what they're doing, and trying to understand why they do what they do. I've been elated, mystified, scared, curious, surprised, inspired, and nervous. And when I think about it, a lot of what I've learned about bears and from them come from my own personal bear stories. But it's pretty hard to describe what it's like to look into those deep brown eyes. How could I possibly put into words the depth of emotion and decision-making that I see when I look into a bear's eyes? And that's why I named John. Our book weaves the science of bear behavior with stories from the field, with John's amazing photos to bring you North America's bears in a way that you've never seen them before. Next slide. So the book, chapter 1, patience and tolerance. Bears, particularly those living in high human use areas, show incredible patience. And we might not think of that as a bear characteristic. But I'm often amazed by how few bear attacks there actually are when I consider human behavior in bear habitat. Look at this bear. I giggle at the thought that I would make such a bad bear because I would bluff charge too many people for violating my personal space while I was trying to eat lunch. And I really don't even like that as a person, but I can tell you that if you were trying to take 80 pictures of me while I was eating a sandwich, I would not just continue eating my sandwich. There are many questionable things that people do to get close to a bear, for a photo or a story to tell their friends. And many people get far too close, and most of the time the bear does nothing. Few people would be so patient and tolerant as an Alberta bear if they had dozens of people closing in on them to take a photo while they were eating. Bears in these cases may even be justified in huffing or growling or even swatting people away. Yet most roadside bears continue eating or just amble away. Bears display patience and tolerance with people and with other bears, but they can also become habituated or food conditioned. And to the average person recreating or living in bear habitat, these terms seem synonymous. But to the wildlife manager, each of these terms is different and comes with a unique series of assumptions, understanding, and management actions. What makes a bear tolerant often has a lot to do with what they eat and how full they are. Next slide. I get into that a lot more in the book, which you'll just have to buy to really understand the difference between those terms. How we manage bears and how people interact with them. Can you hit it more? Oh no, don't hit it yet. I know what I'm trying to do here. What kinds of bears are there and what kinds of people are there? Sorry, let's say that sentence here. How we manage bears and how people interact with them depends on where we are, what kind of bears are there, and what kind of people are there. The type of management response is highly dependent on the level of human activity and human demands on the surrounding landscape. In Alaska bear viewing sites, people are strictly managed to facilitate viewing experience. The predictability of human use is essential to keep bears and people safe in these encounters. If bears know where and when to expect people, they can decide whether they want to be around people. The predictability of human use in space and time has allowed for a highly tolerant bear population to become tolerant of people. And that's where you see a lot of those pictures of people in Alaska standing on a boardwalk and a bear is walking right by, and they're like, oh my God, I could almost pet him. So these are places in Alaska where these bears, people are so restricted, it's like, you're allowed to stand exactly here. And bears know that, and so they go about the landscape in the way that they want to, knowing exactly where and when the people are going to be active. That reduces the level of stress that a bear has around people, but it also allows the bear to be the decision maker. In human-dominated landscapes like Alberta and the lower 48 US states, human use is a lot less predictable. Resources are more scarce, and bears are less tolerant. In protected areas, people can be on any road or any trail at almost any time. And this lack of predictability means that bears don't always get to decide when and where to access habitat in the absence of people. And in these landscapes, we often aim to avoid bears becoming habituated because those that do may have a higher risk of becoming food conditioned, which is when they start eating your garbage and then they become dangerous. Once that is the case, management action is almost always required to ensure public safety. To prevent bears, now you can hit the next slide. Do you see this picture? Yeah, that's a bear destroying a garbage. To prevent bears from becoming food conditioned, managing agencies usually have plans in place to discourage bears from coming near human developments. And this can involve aversive conditioning, which is like chasing the bear or shooting the bear with rubber bullets to give it a negative experience when it comes next to people. And that can be successful if consistently applied, but it still doesn't address the human behavior that is the root of the problem. Next slide. So adaptation and coexistence is chapter 2. In Canada's dynamic landscapes, what coexist varies across man-made boundaries between towns, between provinces and territories, and over the international border we share with the United States. This is a massive challenge for bears because they don't always know how to be a good bear or what behaviors make them problem bears. In reality, even the terms good bear and problem bear are defined by people. Bears are really just bears. When bears don't behave as we expect them to, they are essentially punished through management actions. Some people believe that this repeated punishment can cause bears to be more aggressive around people over the long run, thus reinforcing assumptions that bears are violent and out to get us. Even though research has shown reality is far more complex than these simple assumptions indicate, society continues to expect bears to behave a certain way. Regardless of how many people live in or develop an area, the local bear population must learn specific adaptations to successfully coexist. People, however, must also learn to adapt and coexist. Coexistence is a two-way street. When it comes to coexistence, how we treat bears is just as much a part of the puzzle as how they treat us. Next slide. Come on. Just such a little cutie. In any human-wildlife encounter, people and their reactions are essential parts of the story. A person's level of fear during an encounter can also affect public expectation of management response. In the case of large carnivore management, fear can shape tendencies to support or oppose management actions and government policies directed towards bears. People fear bears, especially when they are approaching settlements or in areas of human use. Just think about the last time you saw a bear, whether that was live or in the media. How afraid were you? Why or why not? And how do you think your fear influenced the bear or your expectations of what should happen next? Next slide. Our knowledge of bears is directly influenced by how we see them. Grizzly bears in the media and other imagery, flyers and films, are often portrayed as dangerous. When I Googled movies with a bear for the book, the movies targeting adults were mostly like Backcountry, The Revenant, and The Edge, where grizzly bears featured on the cover terrorizing people who were running for their lives. Grizzly bears are seen as ferocious and more commonly elicit a fear response, particularly if they are seen in places where they are not expected, like private property. Yeah, you're good. You're all right. I'm going there right now. Yeah, next slide. Go to that, our trip to the Yukon. There we go. All right, so John and I have spent a lot of time in the Bow Valley together. We went to the north coast of BC together for part of the book, and then a few months later we went to the Yukon. And what immediately struck me was how vast the wilderness is up there. With 2 to 3 times as many bears as people, bears have all kinds of space. And I just want you to take a second to think about that. So in the Bow Valley, we have about 25,000 permanent residents and tourists in the millions, and about 65 grizzly bears. In the Yukon, the town of Haines Junction has a population of a few hundred people and about 12,000 grizzly bears. Like, it is exactly opposite. And so that dynamic changes everything about coexistence. Because here, it's about trying to make sure that people create space for bears. But in the Yukon, it's like, I mean, bears. It's more about like, how do we just make sure that we're not disturbing the bears too much so they don't like get into our chicken coops and stuff. And it was on this trip to the Yukon that I began to think about how coexistence is different based on where you are in the world. To coexist requires adaptation. You need to adapt to being around each other, but who has to do most of the adapting depends on who is the more dominant species. And in the Yukon, it wasn't people that dominated the landscape, and that changed what it meant to coexist. Next slide. Okay, I'm gonna read you a little story about these three pictures from the book, obviously. Part of the Kluane ecosystem, Tatanshini-Alsek Provincial Park, is in the very northwest corner of British Columbia. The landscape here is characterized by large mountains to the west and wide forested valleys to the east. The best bear habitat is in the valley bottom, with a mosaic of forests and riverside meadows. As the early morning sun gently kissed the mountaintops with a pink glow, John and I sat along the roadside watching a familiar, beautiful sub-adult grizzly bear. We had been spending the last few mornings with him. Over the week, he had become more habituated to our vehicle and never showed any stress or even acknowledged our presence. The sun was glimmering off the roadside grasses as he grazed on dandelions and local weed, and everything was quiet and still, except my bladder, which was full of coffee and in need of relief. I slowly opened the car door. The bear didn't even look up. I stepped out of the vehicle and closed the door behind me. The bear didn't look up. I took 2 steps away from the car. He didn't look up. I crossed the road away from the bear. No reaction. I took a step into the opposite ditch, crouched down, and peed. He bluff charged. I looked over my shoulder, literally pants around my ankles, and he was staring at me intently. I felt confused and more than a little nervous. I took a deep breath and tried to sound relaxed and non-threatening as I spoke to him in a calm voice. "Oh, hi, buddy. It's okay, buddy." I stood up and walked slowly but purposefully back to the Jeep with him watching me the whole time. I put the vehicle between me and the bear, and he sidestepped to watch me get back in the car. Even though he'd had no reaction to me previously, he was clearly watching me the whole time. "He didn't like that at all," John said once I got back in the car. Yeah, he sure didn't, but I didn't understand why. How did a bear who didn't even care about me at all suddenly get worked up enough to bluff charge? What did I do wrong? Well, I did several things he didn't predict. I didn't stay in my car like a good little human. He very clearly told me I needed to get back in my box of acceptable human activity. Over the next few weeks, I played those events over and over again in my mind, trying to pinpoint what I had done. One of my colleagues suggested it was the action of crouching down in the ditch. In Russia, he had observed male bears sometimes hunching their shoulders down and lowering their head as a sign of dominance and strength. It's possible this bear thought I was challenging him, where he got concerned that suddenly he was not able to see all of my body clearly. Bears have written, suddenly I wasn't trustworthy. In the Yukon, I felt the rules were reversed. Bears have written a complex rulebook for people, and when we step out of line, bears are more than happy to let us know. Next slide. So coexistence, like I said, is living with wildlife, working with wildlife, use the same habitats at either the same or different times. Can you click the next slide again? Please go picture 6. I envision this relationship to be fluid. People change their activities, animals adapt their behavior. Essentially, people and wildlife adapt to share habitat without conflict. Implementing this level of coexistence would mean that all people and all animals display mutual respect all the time, giving each other space and access to resources without competition or conflict. While I think that this is possible, it is utopic. We often struggle to live with wildlife. And I have another excerpt from the book. It's full of them. Living with wildlife implies true coexistence for me. This is a scenario where people and wildlife use the same habitats at either the same or different times. Area 64 in Banff successfully lived a long life around the town of Banff for many years. I envision this relationship to be fluid. People change their activities, animals adapt their behavior. Implementing, okay, hold on, I said all that already. Fast forward. Conversely, living next to wildlife implies that we draw a boundary around our town, and our wildlife lives on one side and people live on the other. For this to work, people would not be allowed in the wildlife side and vice versa. And you can't really see it in this picture, but there's a fence here. That's an electric fence separating polar bears from a viewing area up in Churchill. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with this living next to wildlife. In controlled bear viewing settings, this is possible. In coastal bear viewing operations, people are limited by viewing platforms, boardwalks, or water access. In Nunavut, polar bear viewing operations create a surrounded corral from where people can watch polar bears safely as the bears wander the frozen tundra. In communities, this separation is ineffective because it is not absolute. People expect to cross the boundary to recreate, while also expecting that wildlife will not cross the boundary and come into town. Although this could potentially work in areas where human communities are small and do not occupy prime habitats or movement corridors, the idea is also utopic and unachievable. The essence of coexistence for both scenarios requires both wildlife and people to agree, and we can never convince wildlife to obey all of our rules. If habitat and forage exist within town boundaries, bears will come into town looking for them. If our communities are in river valley bottoms and cut across important movement corridors, bears will need to pass through towns. If there are great recreational trails in bear habitat and movement corridors, people will continue to push bears around in their own habitat. And if neither is truly achievable, then I think we should set the bar high and continually strive for living with wildlife. There are things we can do to reduce the risk of conflict for living with wildlife and improve the likelihood that bears can adapt to human development in ways that lead to coexistence. Next slide. The truth about it all is that coexistence only works when we work together. And this can mean at the individual level, how you manage your attractants on your property. So whether you leave pumpkins out overnight or have an outdoor compost or a bird feeder in the spring. It can also mean how you work with your neighbors to reduce attractants, to work with your municipality to have bear-proof bins and centralized garbage pickup like we have in Canmore. It can also mean how you work together as a community to implement bylaws around coexistence. In Canmore, we have bylaws against outdoor compost and bird feeders from April until October. And we have centralized garbage pickup. We also have a bylaw against fruit trees, which, as you probably are aware, is like super effective. And we also can work together across managing agencies on coexistence on a large landscape scale when we're looking at these different areas that bears cross into. Next slide. But the one thing I want you to understand is that a bear is not just a bear. Sometimes they are silly, and sometimes they stare at you with daggers in their eyes. Sometimes bears know who's boss, and other times they don't even care if you're there. Research shows us that bears are individuals, and so does personal experience. Research can help us to understand how bears use habitat, and what is important to them is they make daily decisions about where to be, and what to eat, and who to be around. But experience can help us understand the personalities of each bear, even if we only see them once. Look at the bears in these two photos. This is the whole reason why I wanted to partner with John on this book. When you look at the black bear on the right, you can tell he's annoyed. His hackles are up, he's staring intently, he's got his head lowered, even has a furrow in his brow. The bear on the left doesn't care about you at all. At the end of the day, what bears have taught me is to just be yourself. And don't be afraid to make it clear how you feel. I wrote this book to help people think about their relationship with bears and maybe to see them a little differently when they encounter them or hear other people speak of them. Bears, just like nature as on a whole, have a lot to teach us. We just have to sit still long enough to listen. And I just want to close with one last slide, next slide, around designs that facilitate coexistence. Because there are several ways that we can change land to make it better. We can have crossing structures under or over roads, which have proven very useful. The older they are, the more they get used. We can warn people or close trails when bears are in the area. And we should plan for these kinds of signs at trailheads so they don't look like we just threw them up yesterday. And we as recreationists can listen to those signs and those recommendations. But we should also engage in recreation trail network planning. It should be planned around wildlife corridors or across them, not through them. The pirate trails should be closed and replanted. Trails can be rerouted to avoid bear habitat. And I wanted to share that because there's a lot of things we can do as individuals, but when we're talking about park management, which I think Jay is you're gonna say something about it, right? So just think about that when you're working with Jay on his big park plan for the Weaselhead. And I'm just gonna close that there. Thank you so much again for having me. Next slide. If you would like to buy my book, I would love you to do that. So it is on sale wherever books are sold. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring any with me tonight because the distributor was sold out, but you can just go to Amazon or you can go to any local bookstore, which I highly recommend to support our local businesses, and buy a copy for yourself and for your friends and your family, and Christmas is coming, so don't hold back. And that is my website there, sarahconsulting.com. If you want to know more about me, and thank you again so much. Thanks for your time.